Pacific War was a conflict of unprecedented brutality, a clash of empires fueled by divergent ideologies and a relentless drive for dominance. But even within that crucible of violence, certain episodes stand out, not just for their strategic significance, but for the profound moral questions they unleashed. Today, we delve into one such chapter, a battle that shattered conventional notions of warfare, rewrote tactical playbooks, and left an indelible scar on the psyches of those who lived through it. We're talking about the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, a 3-day maelstrom in March 1943 that redefined air power, highlighted the chilling efficiency of intelligence, and forced a harrowing confrontation with the ethics of total war. Imagine, if you can, the vast, shimmering expanse of the Bismarck Sea on March the 3rd, 1943. The clock ticks past 10:15 in the morning. A Japanese naval officer, his hand slick with the crude oil that now coated everything, gripped a jagged piece of wood, all that remained of the destroyer Arashio's bridge. His uniform, once crisp and proud, was now a sodden, black mass of fuel oil and seawater. Every fiber of his being was screaming, every sense overwhelmed by the stench of burning oil, the cries of the dying, and the horrifying spectacle unfolding around him. In his mind, words echoed, words that promised to haunt his every waking and sleeping moment for the rest of his existence. He recorded the horror, an internal log of a nightmare made real, a testament to a loss that defied comprehension. Through eyes burning from salt and oil, he watched, transfixed, as American B-25 Mitchell bombers executed another wide predatory circle above the debris field. This wasn't just wreckage, it was the shattered remains of hope, stretching for miles across the once pristine turquoise waters. Oil slicks spread like monstrous, cancerous blooms. Twisted metal burned with an unholy fire, and everywhere thousands of men, his countrymen, desperately clung to anything that offered even a momentary reprieve from the depths. The mighty convoy, which had set sail from Rabaul just 2 days prior, with such unwavering confidence, such high expectations, was now nothing more than flotsam and jetsam, scattered across a watery grave. But the survivors, those who had miraculously escaped the initial inferno, were about to discover that their ordeal was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning, descending into a realm of horror that transcended any battlefield nightmare they could have ever conceived. This story isn't just about a battle. It's about the collision of technological innovation, strategic intelligence, human endurance, and the brutal realities that emerge when the conventional rules of engagement are utterly rewritten. It's a story of shifting power dynamics, a testament to the devastating effectiveness of air superiority, and a chilling examination of the moral ambiguities that define total war. The seeds of this disaster were sown months earlier, in the opulent but increasingly anxious halls of the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, commanding the formidable 8th Area Army at Rabaul, faced a situation that was rapidly deteriorating. New Guinea, a vast and unforgiving island, had become a pivotal battleground, a strategic choke point in the Pacific theater. The Allies were advancing, slowly but inexorably, tightening their grip and pushing the Japanese forces into an ever more desperate defensive posture. The decision, reached in late December 1942, was stark. New Guinea had to be reinforced. A massive convoy operation was the only way to ferry the necessary troops and supplies. This wasn't just a military maneuver, it was a gamble, a desperate roll of the dice in a war where the stakes were nothing less than the fate of an empire. The plan was audacious, perhaps even foolhardy, given the growing Allied air superiority. 8 destroyers, formidable warships in their own right, would escort 8 transport ships. These transports would carry the main body of the 51st Division, elite troops, hardened by combat in China, now redeployed to the Southwest Pacific to face a new, relentless enemy. On February 28, 1943, under the watchful gaze of Japanese fighter aircraft, the convoy departed Simpson Harbor in Rabaul. The air buzzed with a mixture of apprehension and grim determination. They were sailing towards what they believed would be a decisive engagement, a chance to halt the Allied advance and turn the tide in New Guinea. What they would encounter instead would not merely challenge their training or test their courage. It would utterly shatter every conception of warfare they had been taught. Every deeply ingrained notion of honor between enemies, and every comforting assumption about American military conduct that Japanese propaganda had so meticulously instilled in them. They were about to sail into an abyss, a meticulously planned trap, orchestrated by an enemy who knew their every move. Leading this ambitious, high-stakes operation was Rear Admiral Masatami Kimura, a seasoned veteran of countless successful convoy missions. His flag flew proudly from the destroyer Shirayuki. Kimura, a man who understood the capricious nature of the sea and the brutal calculus of war, knew the risks intimately. The 18th Army staff, in their pre-operation war games, had grimly predicted substantial losses, 4 out of 10 transports, and a staggering 30 to 40 aircraft. The chances of success were rated at a mere 50-50, a coin toss in the face of overwhelming odds. Such low probabilities might have deterred a less resolute force, but the strategic necessity was paramount. The fate of New Guinea, and perhaps the wider Pacific campaign, hinged on these ships and the men they carried. As March 1, 1943 dawned, a sense of foreboding hung in the air. The convoy, an almost impossibly vulnerable collection of ships in a hostile sea, rounded the northern coast of New Britain. Then, the inevitable happened. The first American reconnaissance aircraft appeared, a solitary B-24 Liberator from the 91st Bombardment Group, a metallic shark circling its unsuspecting prey. What the Japanese High Command, and indeed Admiral Kimura, couldn't know was that their every move, every subtle shift in their audacious plan, had been anticipated. It wasn't guesswork. It was a cold, hard fact rooted in an intelligence triumph of epic proportions. Deep within the Allied intelligence network, specifically at naval code-breaking centers in Melbourne, Australia, at Frumel, Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, and across the vast ocean in Washington, D.C., a silent war had been waged and won. The Allies had intercepted, decrypted, and translated Japanese messages. These weren't mere snippets of information. They were comprehensive intelligence reports, detailing the convoy's precise composition, its intended destination, Lae, New Guinea, and, crucially, its exact date of arrival. The Japanese, with an almost fatalistic overconfidence in the impenetrability of their codes, were sailing blind into a meticulously prepared ambush. Their confidence in their cipher systems, particularly the JN-25 naval code, was absolute, a dangerous hubris that would cost them dearly. They believed their communications were a sacred vault, impenetrable to enemy ears. But Allied cryptographers, working tirelessly and with extraordinary skill, had picked the lock, revealing every secret. At 5th Air Force Headquarters, General George C. Kenney, a tough, innovative airman known for his aggressive tactics, received the news he had been waiting for. For months, his air crews had been engaged in a relentless pursuit of aerial innovation, perfecting a revolutionary bombing technique. This technique, known as skip bombing, was a low-level attack method, independently developed by several combatant nations during World War II, including Italy, Australia, Britain, the Soviet Union, and, critically, the United States. It was deceptively simple in concept, yet devastatingly effective in practice. An aircraft would release a bomb at a very low altitude, allowing it to literally skip across the water's surface like a flat stone, directly into the side of an enemy vessel. But Kenney's vision didn't stop there. He had entrusted Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn, a legendary figure in the 5th Air Force known for his engineering prowess and unorthodox solutions, with a task: transform the B-25 Mitchell medium bomber into a flying gunship. Gunn, a civilian expatriate with a knack for improvisation, had taken the sturdy B-25 and outfitted its nose with an astonishing array of up to 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. These weren't just auxiliary weapons, they were primary armaments, capable of unleashing a torrent of lead that could rip through anti-aircraft positions, suppress deck crews, and tear apart light fortifications. When combined with the precise art of skip bombing, these modified B-25s became the ultimate anti-shipping weapon, capable of delivering immense firepower and destructive force at point-blank range. The B-25, originally designed as a medium bomber, had been repurposed into a terror-inducing, low-altitude precision strike platform. This was tactical innovation on a grand scale, a game-changer that would soon be unleashed upon the unsuspecting Japanese convoy. Dawn on March the 2nd broke gray and overcast, a natural shroud for the impending storm. The weather held for a time, but at 10 hours, as if on cue, the clouds parted. The Japanese convoy, steaming confidently towards its doom, was suddenly exposed. High above, a force of 29 B-17 flying fortresses appeared, silver specks against the brightening sky. These were the high-altitude precision bombers, but on this day, their mission was not just to bomb. It was to soften the target, to sow chaos and confusion, and to draw the Japanese air defenses upward, away from the true danger lurking below the radar horizon. The B-17s struck with devastating accuracy. A large merchant vessel, the Kyoko Maru, already burdened with 1,500 troops and highly flammable drums of aviation fuel, took a direct hit. Pilots reported seeing the transport break in half, an apocalyptic spectacle as the 493-ton ship erupted in a monstrous fireball, a pillar of flame and smoke visible from every vessel in the convoy. 2 other ships were damaged, and a destroyer was set ablaze. The inferno was a chilling omen of what was to come. Immediately, the destroyers Asagumo and Yukikaze, acting on instinct and the code of the sea, moved to rescue survivors, pulling oil-soaked men from the churning water. This act of humanity, while commendable, proved tactically dangerous. To retrieve the men, the destroyers had to reduce speed, making them vulnerable, slowing the entire convoy. The seeds of destruction were being sown not just by American bombs, but by the very human impulse to save lives, a stark reminder of the tragic choices imposed by war. The scene was one of utter pandemonium, the air thick with the smell of burning flesh and fuel, the water dotted with desperate figures clinging to anything that could float. For those on the Kyoko Maru, their fate was sealed in an instant. a flash of fire, and then the cold embrace of the sea. The morning of March the 3rd dawned with a brutal clarity. The skies were clear, the perfect flying weather that Allied airmen had prayed for, and the Japanese had desperately feared. The convoy, now reduced to 7 transports and 8 destroyers, had managed to cover nearly 2/3 of the distance to Leh. They might have harbored a fragile hope that the worst was behind them. They were tragically mistaken. At precisely 10 hours, death arrived. Not from a single direction, but from all points of the compass, a symphony of destruction orchestrated with ruthless precision. In a span of roughly 15 minutes, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, an engagement that would fundamentally alter the course of World War II in the Pacific, was decided. The carefully laid Japanese plans, their strategic objectives, their very survival, unraveled with horrifying speed. First, the high-altitude B-17s reappeared, majestic yet menacing, once again drawing Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns skyward. The Japanese defenders, eyes fixed on the distant threats above, were completely unprepared for the true horror that swept in at mast height, barely clearing the waves. 13 Australian bow fighters, swift and deadly, raked the decks of the transports with their 8 forward-firing guns, scything down anti-aircraft crews and any exposed personnel. The sound was a deafening roar, a tearing fabric of metal and flesh. Behind them, the modified B-25s, the flying gunships, approached so low that their propeller wash literally kicked up spray from the water's surface. The skip bombing technique, honed through months of daring practice, proved devastatingly effective. Bombs, released at breakneck speed, skipped twice, 3 times across the water, either slamming directly into the ship's hulls at the waterline or submerging just beneath the surface to explode with gut-wrenching force. The impact wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The Japanese had never witnessed such a method of attack. It was close quarters, personal, and utterly overwhelming. Captain Ed Lanigan, leading the 90th Squadron's modified B-25s, exemplified this new brutal efficiency. He approached the transport Teiyo Maru at wave height, his forward guns spitting tracers that instantly silenced the ship's anti-aircraft positions. With the defenses suppressed, Lanigan's bombs, released with split-second timing, skipped twice before tearing into the Teiyo Maru's hull. The 6,270-ton transport broke in half and vanished beneath the waves within minutes, taking thousands of men with her. It was a cold, clinical demonstration of overwhelming air power. By 10:15, a mere 15 minutes after the initial coordinated assault, the unthinkable had happened. All 7 remaining transports had been hit, many already sinking or ablaze. 3 of their destroyer escorts had been badly damaged or had already plunged to the depths. Admiral Kimura's flagship, the destroyer Shirayuki, took a direct hit that detonated her forward magazine. She disappeared in a colossal explosion, a violent punctuation mark in the unfolding catastrophe. The sky was filled with smoke, the sea with fire, and the air with the screams of the dying. By noon on March 3rd, the Bismarck Sea had become a true hellscape. Oil fires blazed across the surface, turning the water into a molten, viscous expanse. The sea, thick with bunker fuel, was a chaotic mess of debris and thousands upon thousands of men. Soldiers who couldn't swim, exhausted sailors, the wounded clinging desperately to any piece of wreckage that could offer flotation. Conservative estimates placed over 3,000 men in the water, their lives hanging by the thinnest of threads. The 4 surviving destroyers, Yukikaze, Asagamo, Uranami, and Shikinami, began the desperate and almost impossible task of rescue operations. They managed to pull approximately 2,700 survivors from the water, ferrying them back to Rabaul. But their efforts were a drop in the ocean of human suffering, and they knew their time was limited. Allied aircraft would inevitably return, and return they did. At 14 odd hours on March 3rd, the American planes reappeared, but this time their purpose was chillingly different. The survivors in the water, their faces streaked with oil and fear, watched with a fleeting, desperate relief as the aircraft approached. Surely, they thought, these planes were merely photographing the destruction, documenting their victory. That fragile hope was brutally extinguished as the planes descended, not to observe, but to kill. They dropped to wave height and opened fire, their machine guns spitting a deadly hail into the water. In a move that remains profoundly controversial, Allied aircraft patrolled the waters for several days, systematically strafing survivors in lifeboats and on rafts. This action was later justified by the Allies as a grim necessity. These were enemy soldiers who, if they reached shore, would undoubtedly reinforce the Japanese garrison at Leh, continuing the fight. B-25s, A-20 Havocs, and Beaufighters made repeated passes, their machine guns churning the oil-slicked water into a bloody foam. From the American perspective, the tactical justification was stark and clear. General Kenny's orders were explicit, chillingly unambiguous. No Japanese soldier was to reach New Guinea alive. This wasn't about cruelty for its own sake, at least not in the minds of the commanders. It was about preventing the enemy from regrouping, from sustaining their war effort. The proximity to shore, sometimes as close as 10 to 15 miles, meant that many survivors could potentially reach land and rejoin the fight. This was total war, a conflict where the lines between combatant and non-combatant, between active threat and helpless victim, blurred into a terrifying gray. For the Japanese in the water, however, this act transcended all military logic and violated every concept of honorable warfare they held sacred. The Bushido Code, the ancient samurai philosophy that permeated Japanese military culture, spoke of treating defeated enemies with dignity, of honor even in surrender. What they experienced in the Bismarck Sea shattered these deeply held assumptions completely. It wasn't just a physical assault, it was a profound spiritual trauma, a desecration of their fundamental beliefs about war and valor. They witnessed a ruthlessness they believed only an uncivilized foe could exhibit, an act that stripped away any veneer of mutual respect that might exist between combatants. This was an enemy who would not just defeat you, but annihilate you, leaving nothing behind. As darkness fell on March the 3rd, the nightmare only intensified. American PT boats, swift and deadly, entered the area. Under the command of Lieutenant Commander Barry Atkins, a force of 10 U.S. Navy PT boats systematically hunted survivors through the night. Their powerful searchlights swept across the water, cutting through the gloom, followed by the terrifying chatter of machine gun fire. PT-43 and PT-150 located the damaged transport Oigawa Maru, still miraculously afloat but barely clinging to life. They torpedoed it, sending yet more men, already traumatized and exhausted, plunging back into the frigid, oil-choked waters. For the Japanese survivors, the night brought additional primal horrors. Sharks, drawn by the smell of blood, and the desperate, distressed movements of thousands of struggling men began to attack. Men who had miraculously survived the sinking, the strafing, and the torpedo attacks now faced a new, ancient predator from below. The sea, which they had hoped would be their salvation, had become a merciless arbiter of death, teeming with unseen terrors. The psychological toll of facing not just an armed enemy, but the very savagery of nature, was immeasurable. Dawn on March 4th revealed the full, catastrophic scope of the disaster. The debris field, a gruesome testament to the battle's ferocity, stretched for an astonishing 40 miles. Small groups of survivors, ghostly figures against the vastness of the sea, still dotted the water, many having endured over 20 hours in the suffocating embrace of the ocean. With the sunrise, the American aircraft returned, relentless and unforgiving. B-25s, A-20s, Beaufighters, and P-38 Lightning fighters systematically attacked anything that moved, any vessel, any raft, any human form that offered a glimmer of hope. The destroyer Asashio, which had bravely remained behind to continue rescuing survivors from her sister ship Arashio, became a particular target. In the morning, a B-17 scored a direct hit with a 500-pound bomb while she was engaged in this humanitarian effort. She sank quickly, taking not only her own crew, but also the rescued soldiers with her into the deep. The scene was one of unparalleled ruthlessness, a grim efficiency that prioritized tactical victory above all else. The American justification for the strafing, while rooted in military necessity, also carried a distinct undertone of revenge. As recorded by James Duffy in his book, War at the End of the World, an incident prior to the Bismarck Sea battle had deeply enraged American pilots. A B-17 named Double Trouble, piloted by Lieutenant Woodrow W. Moore, had collided with a Japanese Zero. As 7 members of the bomber crew parachuted helplessly towards the ground, several Zeros deliberately gunned them down in midair. This horrific act was witnessed by crews of other American bombers, igniting a furious desire for retribution. General Kenny, ever the pragmatist and the aggressive commander, euphemistically called these continuous attacks on survivors mopping up operations. For the next several days, American and Australian airmen returned to the site of the battle, systematically prowling the seas, not for combat, but in search of Japanese survivors. Kenny's orders to strafe lifeboats and rafts, later documented in a secret March 20, 1943 report, stated that the slaughter continued till nightfall. If any survivors were permitted to slip by our strafing aircraft, they were a minimum of 30 miles from land in water thickly infested by man-eating sharks. The implication was clear. If the planes didn't get them, the ocean, with its predatory inhabitants, would. There was to be no quarter given. Amidst this relentless carnage, a glimmer of hope for some survivors arrived in the form of Japanese submarines. The I-17 and I-26, moving cautiously to avoid the ever-present Allied aircraft, attempted daring rescue operations. On March 6th, they managed to pick up 170 survivors. 2 days later, the I-26 found another 54 and successfully put them ashore at Leh. But these submarines could only take limited numbers, leaving hundreds, perhaps thousands, behind. The submarine crews described horrific scenes. Men calling out desperately in the darkness, oil-covered survivors too weak to climb aboard, the agonizing necessity of choosing who to save and who to leave to their fate. These were indelible images, haunting those who witnessed them. The statistics of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea were staggering, a stark testament to the Allied victory. Of the 6,900 troops of the 51st Division, critically needed in New Guinea, only about 200 actually made it to Lae. Another 2,000 were rescued by the destroyers and submarines and returned to Rabaul. Approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were killed outright, lost to the sea and the relentless Allied attacks. American losses, in contrast, were minimal: 4 aircraft and 13 airmen. This 230-to-1 casualty ratio was unprecedented in naval warfare, a brutal testament to the efficacy of combined air power and intelligence. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked a pivotal turning point in the Pacific. As a direct result of these devastating losses, the Japanese Imperial Navy never again risked sending a large convoy into waters controlled by American aircraft in the Southwest Pacific. The tactical lessons were too stark, the cost too high. Japan would never again attempt to reinforce its garrisons by surface convoy within range of Allied air power. The strategic initiative in New Guinea was effectively conceded. After the war, Captain Tamichi Hara, who commanded the destroyer Shigure, not present at the battle, interviewed survivors and penned one of the most famous Japanese assessments of the engagement. His words resonate with a profound sense of shock and despair. Never was there such a debacle. He contrasted it sharply with the successful, almost miraculous withdrawal operation from Guadalcanal, a strategic retreat that, while a defeat, was executed with considerable skill. Hara's interviews with participants revealed the profound psychological devastation inflicted by the Bismarck Sea. The feeling among the Japanese was one of utter disbelief. Their defeat there was, quite simply, unbelievable. The battle showcased revolutionary aerial warfare techniques that the Japanese hadn't anticipated and couldn't counter. Skip bombing, combined with heavily armed strafer aircraft, had transformed medium bombers into true ship killers. While skip bombing had been used previously, notably against Imperial Japanese Navy warships and transports by Major William Benn of the 63rd Squadron in the Southwest Pacific, it was the modifications pioneered by Major Paul Pappy Gunn that elevated these tactics to a new level of lethality. Gunn, a genius of battlefield improvisation, created strafer versions of the A-20 and B-25, arming them with 8 to 14 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. These aircraft could decimate anti-aircraft defenses before delivering bombs at point-blank range, a terrifying 1-2 punch that overwhelmed the enemy's ability to respond. These weren't just bombers. They were flying battleships, capable of unparalleled destruction against naval targets. Not all survivors met their end in the water. Small, desperate groups managed to reach various islands, only to begin new struggles for survival. One band of 18 survivors landed on Kiriwena, where they were eventually captured by PT-114. Another group made its way to Guadalcanal, only to be killed by an American patrol. On Goodenough Island, Australian patrols from the 47th Infantry Battalion actively hunted Japanese survivors between March 8th and 14th, 1943, killing 72, capturing 42, and finding another 9 dead on a raft. These were grim epilogues to an already brutal battle, illustrating the relentless nature of jungle warfare and the determination of the Allied forces to prevent any remnant of the Japanese invasion force from regrouping. The Japanese military, steeped in the Bushido tradition, faced a fundamental crisis after the Bismarck Sea Massacre. The code emphasized honor in combat, respect for enemies, and dignity in defeat. The methodical killing of helpless men in the water, however, violated every principle they understood. It was an act of perceived barbarity that contradicted their deeply held cultural values. The survivors who returned to Rabaul were profoundly changed, not just physically, but mentally. They had witnessed an American ruthlessness that directly contradicted all the carefully crafted propaganda about American weakness and cowardice. The image of aircraft systematically hunting men in the water, not for sport, but for cold, calculated tactical efficiency, would haunt Japanese forces throughout the Pacific, sowing seeds of doubt and despair. Many survivors reported a complete loss of faith in victory. If Americans would machine gun helpless men in the water, what wouldn't they do? This psychological impact was immense, influencing future Japanese decisions to fight to the death rather than surrender, convinced that capture meant certain execution. The strafing of survivors remains one of the most controversial aspects of the Pacific War, a dark stain on the otherwise celebrated Allied victory. Under international law, shipwreck survivors who are helpless should be protected. However, the law at the time was ambiguous about enemy combatants who had not formally surrendered. The context of total war further complicated these distinctions. It's also crucial to remember that Japanese forces had committed their own horrific atrocities throughout the war. The rape of Nanking, the Bataan Death March, and the machine gunning of American aircrews in parachutes were grim realities. These acts of brutality undoubtedly contributed to the Allied pilots' mindset and, in some cases, fueled a desire for revenge. Yet, the Bismarck Sea represented something different. Killing for tactical efficiency rather than explicit cruelty, a cold calculation to prevent reinforcement, even if it meant violating the unwritten rules of engagement. American veterans defended the actions as military necessity. These weren't surrendered prisoners of war. They were enemy soldiers heading to reinforce a critical stronghold at Leh. The proximity to shore, sometimes as little as 10 to 15 miles, meant that many could potentially reach land, pick up weapons, and continue fighting. In a war of attrition, where every soldier counted, the logic was chillingly pragmatic. Eliminate the threat, even if it meant eliminating the helpless. The Bismarck Sea disaster forced a complete reassessment of Japanese strategy in the Southwest Pacific. Admiral Mineichi Koga, who succeeded the legendary Yamamoto as commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, recognized with stark clarity that surface vessels could no longer survive in waters dominated by enemy aircraft. New Guinea was effectively abandoned as indefensible by sea. The psychological impact rippled throughout Japanese forces. Units scheduled for transport began experiencing unprecedented desertion rates. The prospect of being caught at sea by American aircraft became a terror surpassing combat itself. The fear of that watery grave, presided over by relentless aerial predators, was a new, profound horror. For the Americans, the battle proved a momentous strategic lesson. Air power alone could indeed defeat naval forces. Land-based aircraft, properly equipped and trained, could dominate sea lanes without the direct support of aircraft carriers, a concept that profoundly influenced Pacific strategy for the remainder of the war. It cemented the doctrine of air superiority as a prerequisite for any successful offensive. After the war, the question of whether the strafing constituted a war crime was quietly debated, but never prosecuted. The official American position maintained that these were enemy combatants who could have reached shore and continued fighting. The absence of prosecution for American commanders, while Japanese officers were executed for similar acts against helpless Allied personnel, reflected the uncomfortable reality of victor's justice, a historical phenomenon where the victors dictate the moral and legal terms of conflict. Both sides had crossed lines in the Pacific War's brutal conduct, but only the losers faced formal judgment. Historians universally recognize the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as a watershed moment in aerial warfare. The statistics tell the starkest part of the story. All 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers destroyed, approximately 3,000 Japanese killed, versus a mere 13 Allied airmen lost. But beyond these numbers, the battle represented a profound transformation of warfare itself. The marriage of cutting-edge technology and superior intelligence had produced casualty ratios that were, in essence, massacres. The image of aircraft methodically strafing helpless men became emblematic of the Pacific War's merciless nature, a symbol of the brutal efficiency that modern warfare could unleash. General Douglas MacArthur, a figure not prone to understatement, famously called it the decisive aerial engagement of the war in the Southwest Pacific. His assessment proved accurate. Japan never recovered the strategic initiative in New Guinea. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea demonstrated that modern warfare had evolved beyond traditional concepts of combat between armed forces. Air power, combined with intelligence superiority and technological innovation, could produce annihilation rather than a conventional victory. For Japan, it marked the beginning of the end in the Southwest Pacific. Unable to reinforce or supply its garrisons within Allied air range, Japanese forces in the region were condemned to isolation, starvation, and eventual destruction. It was a strategic stranglehold, tightened by the remorseless application of air power. For America, it proved their transformation from the shocked victims of Pearl Harbor into practitioners of ruthless, almost clinical efficiency. The same nation that had been stunned by a surprise attack had become capable of methodically destroying thousands of enemies with a chilling precision. The enduring controversy over strafing survivors reflects war's inherent moral complexity. Military necessity, as perceived by the Allies, and humanitarian law collided in the oil-slicked waters of the Bismarck Sea. Both sides learned a terrible lesson. In total war, traditional limits, however cherished, would be repeatedly crossed. The rules of engagement, often fragile even in conventional conflict, crumbled under the weight of existential struggle. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands as one of the most decisive and controversial engagements of World War II. In just 3 days, American and Australian air power utterly destroyed an entire Japanese convoy, killing thousands and ending any hope of reinforcing New Guinea by sea. The shocked Japanese survivors, who witnessed Americans strafing helpless men in the water, carried psychological wounds that, for many, never healed. They had encountered an enemy capable of ruthlessness beyond their imagination, shattering long-held assumptions about American weakness and, more profoundly, the very nature of warfare itself. The battle's legacy extends far beyond its immediate strategic impact. It profoundly demonstrated air power's ability to dominate sea lanes, the inestimable value of intelligence in modern warfare, and the moral ambiguities inherent in total war. The image of aircraft systematically killing survivors remains one of the Pacific War's most troubling episodes, a dark echo of the desperation and barbarity that can erupt when humanity pushes itself to the brink. In the end, approximately 3,000 Japanese died in the waters of the Bismarck Sea, not in glorious face-to-face combat, but in a methodical, almost impersonal slaughter from above and below. Their shocked survivors returned to spread word of an American ruthlessness that would profoundly influence Japanese military psychology for the remainder of the war, contributing to the fight-to-the-death mentality that characterized later island campaigns. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea proved that in modern warfare, technological superiority, combined with unwavering resolve, could produce annihilation. The Japanese were shocked by American willingness to kill without quarter, learning that their enemies had evolved into something more terrible than any propaganda had ever suggested. That lesson, learned in blood and terror over 3 horrific days in March 1943, would shape the Pacific War's increasingly brutal character, driving both sides to ever greater extremes until its ultimate atomic conclusion. It serves as a stark reminder not just of military triumph, but of the moral abyss that war can open, challenging us to confront the true cost of victory and the indelible scars left by a conflict where survival often demanded the unthinkable.